So I'm just going to play this in the background and hopefully it's all goes okay. So this is a kind of, this is some footage from just a tick. So this is footage from a residency that I undertook in 2017 on Governor's Island in New York City. So this was part of the Light and Space residency at Holo Center, the Center for Holographic and Light-Based Art. And so what I was proposing was to record and visualize my embodied response to drone piloting. So my specific interest at the time was really kind of in response to a lot of the theory that was emerging about drone vision, and particularly around this idea of like the totalized bird's eye perspective, which obviously is still a really important part of military drone theory. But I guess I really was finding that civilian drone piloting had a kind of a different quality and was often a very sort of precarious, paranoid, sweaty experience, which was kind of in line with what Garrett describes as the multi-sensual quality of drone flight. So this was particularly evident in this research residency that I undertook, where I was a foreign visiting artist doing something which was kind of in a bit of a gray area of legality, where I was never really sure if and I occasionally got shut down while piloting here on the island. And I could never get a really definitive sense of whether it was a legal or whatever act. And I guess the movement of the drone and the drone flights while I was in residency really reflected this also. I spent a lot of time lurking in the abandoned spaces on the island. And I think this is a really, and moving along the treetops and over buildings and trying to generally avoid being seen. I think it's interesting to note the way that that has in itself kind of shaped a lot of amateur drone aesthetics, in that some of the legal parameters around moving around people has moved people to explore spaces like, liminal spaces like beaches and cliffs, and also uninhabited spaces as well. My real interest was in the data from the drone, and specifically this is the Keyhole markup language data created by the drone. So I really want to point to the real focus of my PhD is on the kind of phantom aesthetic qualities of geospatial data as they relate to Furocchi's use of the term. So obviously Furocchi uses phantom to describe something of the evasive, subjective perspective of the warhead, which has this strange parallel to the cinematic conventions of like POV camera footage, while also embodying an impossible perspective that is associated with accuracy and precision. So for me, geospatial data and GPS data specifically has this kind of similar relationship, but in relation to drawing and the handmade, in that the aesthetics of GPS data strangely echo the kind of embodied expressive line work qualities of drawing, yet is produced by technologies that are kind of more widely understood and framed in terms of accuracy and like quantification. So for me, GPS data and KML markup, all that kind of stuff has a strong visual relationship to the kind of gestural aspect of drawing, yet this is a kind of like a phantom association. So, and I guess this is kind of a very familiar framing for a lot of artists, people like Jeremy Wood, Layla Curtis. So I apologize for the low resolution on this as well. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to be too slow to buffer. But I guess glimpsing into some of these traces as well, you start to see the kind of messiness that emerges from GPS data, which is kind of this, entirely affected as well by atmospheric interference. And a lot of the kind of, those that are familiar with GPS data, it's kind of this very messy data that can have, huge tolerances for error based on like hardware and software and meteorological interference and all that sort of stuff. So I guess glimpsing into GPS data, it was very much this kind of, we see how kind of erratic it is. And I was interested in this mismatch between the kind of association with accuracy and the pervasive errors and the relationship to drawing. So this is what Keyhole markup language looks like in Excel. And hopefully you can see, it might be a bit artifacted, but essentially you kind of have this really dizzying array of like battery temperature, longitude, latitude, wind direction, all of that, all these kind of like fascinating fields that the drone is recording as this kind of analytical, just to kind of mainly as a hidden way of determining whether, if a drone crashes, whether it was a human error or whether it was kind of like the fault of the manufacturer. And so my interest in visualizing data visualization was to take this data or the kind of positional aspects of this data. I think there's more work to be done in some of the other fields here. And then kind of combining this data with data from the body. But rather than kind of doing something that was a bit more, this kind of fraught and problematic, like emotional mapping, I was kind of interested in mapping it into this other phantom visualization form, which is digital holography, which has a kind of a militaristic link in that it's a form of terrain visualization used by the US Army that also has this phantom quality as well, in that it's described in terms of superior accuracy and situational awareness, but is often kind of like very strange and fragmented and disorienting. So this is the galvanic skin response sensor that I use to record data from my body in terms of sweat response data. And so this data was recorded for each drone flight. Again, I apologize for the very poor screen recording of this one. But essentially on the left, you have the duration. And then on the right, you have the kind of like 20 per second readings from the sensor. And so what I was interested in doing was to use this data, this kind of like ambiguous metric of emotional intensity recorded by the galvanic skin response sensor, to computationally intervene into drone flight data. And in a way that kind of like reinserted or reinscribed the body into this kind of like abstracted process. So this is on the left, Grasshopper, left is Rhino and the plugin Grasshopper, computational design plugin. And this was what was used to create the data visualizations, the artistic visualizations. So I think it's worth noting in this kind of data visualization workflow that there's always a kind of a process of translation where the data kind of has to be crowbarred into the format that's required of the software in order to be kind of read. So I think that that's kind of an important thing in thinking about a lot of these in terms of data visualizations, especially is like the way that it's always this process of translation that where interference kind of and uncertainty can creep in as well as like other forms of like artifacts and error. So this was initially visualized as a hologram for International Conference on Display Holography in 2018. And the intent with this work was to, well, I created geometry in response to data from the body along a particular flight route that kind of produced obscurity as much as it tried to fly. It may have kind of hinted towards some sort of like embodied sensibility as well. And so I guess from iterating from this, I started to become more interested in the various steps along this process to kind of investigate the ways in which interference pervades geospatial data and drone data, and kind of exploring ways of evidencing these forms of interference kind of as a way of like evidencing the kind of having been made quality, and trying to acknowledge the presence of conversion, computation, and translation, and how these kind of affect the visual and aesthetic qualities of the end visualization as well. So I guess in kind of wrapping up, in my final project, my final works, and iterating from the previous hologram, I started to use digital fabrication to emphasize these qualities and to layer interference, the interference of algorithm, material, and geospatial data. So my interest as a practitioner is in magnifying the phantom qualities of these forms of data as an evidence of how an artwork is made, rather than to diminish or hide these forms of mediation and labor. Thanks, guys.